All right, we'll get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Well Said. Today, I want to discuss censorship in the filmmaking industry and how it has gone from bad to worse. Our guest today is Michael Pack, who is the founder and president of Manifold Productions, an independent film and television production company, which he founded in 1977. Through Manifold Productions, Mr. Pack has written, directed, and produced numerous award-winning nationally broadcast documentaries, as well as corporate and educational films. His most recent film, Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words, a 2-hour documentary, opened in movie theaters in January 2020 and was broadcast nationally via PBS. However, it wasn't long before the progressives at companies such as Amazon tried to cancel this film by making it inaccessible during Black History Month. The canceling of Created Equal is just one of the many attempts by the left to censor conservative films. We've seen Hollywood fire actors who support conservative policies, forced apologies by producers who offend the left's fragile sensibilities or the sensibilities of the Chinese Communist Party, which we can talk more about later. However, what made the canceling of the Clarence Thomas film unique was the timing. It wasn't just a random cancellation. It was done at a very specific time when people would be most interested in hearing his story. It was done during Black History Month. And it was a blatant attempt to hide and manipulate what the public was exposed to in this regard. It got me thinking, how are these corporate oligarchs any different than George Orwell's Ministry of Truth? A ministry that manipulated news, art, books, and films to reflect the narrative of those in power. We quote Orwell quite a bit these days. It's hard not to draw the parallels. But we must also remember something that Winston Churchill once said. History is written by the victors. So what exactly is it that we are witnessing here? We've seen attempts to rewrite history in classrooms, but how far gone are we with regard to film and television, as these are very much a part of how we characterize and define very important moments in history? So is Hollywood censorship on conservative viewpoints a trajectory to getting worse, or are we going to reach a breaking point? And what will it take to reach that breaking point? So thank you, Michael, for joining me. Really appreciate you taking the time. You have a wonderful background in all of this, so can't wait to hear your thoughts. And you, in addition to filmmaking, you also have held a number of positions in broadcast media and in the government, doing with international broadcasts as well. So I'm really curious, just to start off, if you could outline maybe some of the basic trends you've been seeing with regards to censorship in broadcast media, television, and film.
Well, it's true that I was really shocked to have Amazon cancel our film during Black History Month. I mean, it had been on PBS. It's not a work of propaganda or advocacy. It simply allows Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the most important Black men in America, no matter what you think of him, to have a voice, to tell his story. And his story is an amazing story, from coming from dire poverty in the segregated South to the Supreme Court. And it's a great American success story with twists and turns. And he has a lot of very interesting views on important matters. It was shocking that Amazon took it off. Now, they, of course, deny that it's censorship. They claim that they took off a whole bunch of documentaries at the same time. But my feeling is, like, why didn't they put it back? There was a huge outcry. There was Jason Riley wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, but many prominent people, Republicans and some Democrats, asked them to put it back, and they did not. And now 19 senators led by Tom Cotton wrote to Amazon to ask why. And again, they say, it's just an algorithm, but why not put it back? I mean, to me, it's still a mystery.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Cherise, that the only explanation that I can think of is the political one.
Yeah, and so is this common with regard to not just like censoring and taking films down, but is it something that you're seeing where more and more people are holding back with what they put in films in order to avoid situations like this? Or is this, or do you feel like just in general, they're not making conservative films and documentaries to avoid situations like this?
Well, I do think it's harder and harder every year for conservatives in Hollywood, and they are making it harder for any right of center film or television to get a platform. But I think that your latter point is quite right, Cherise. The main way the left dominates the culture is by simply putting out all the films and television from the points of view that they believe in, and controlling and creating all the institutions of culture. So there isn't that much left for them to censor, actually. and I'm often asked, why is it that the left controls Hollywood and documentaries and nonfiction television and the rest? And I think that the answer is that they have been serious about it. They announced since the 1960s that they were going to do a long march through the institutions, starting really with the university, but definitely including Hollywood, the media, my area, documentaries, and they have just put time, money, talent, and energy in it over the last 50 years. And on the other side, we have not. So, I put it this way sometimes, they spend billions of dollars in this area, in looking even just at documentaries instead of small movies alone. Public broadcasting, where I have worked, is itself a $2.5 billion a year industry. And that doesn't account for all the money that Ford and MacArthur and the others pump into this, to say nothing of the for-profit, very woke Hollywood production companies. So they're spending at least tens of billions of dollars. And on the sort of conservative side, maybe it's tens of millions. So that's a gap of tens of billions of dollars over 50 years. So it has created the situation that we're in, and it cannot be reversed quickly, which I know always disappoints conservatives. They look for a magic bullet, but there is no magic bullet. We have to do as they did, put in the time and energy. In the case of culture, it is a free market. We are free to produce it and create these institutions, and we simply have not. So it is really, I think, on us. And I think it's important to realize that not only are they producing, looking just at documentaries, a huge number every year, and they're actually of very high quality, but they have also been serious about the other ancillary institutions. So film schools, there are like 4,000 or so universities in the country. They are all left-leaning. I have never met a conservative film professor. I mean, they're even rarer than in the humanities. And they graduate, hundreds of thousands of students a year, or tens of thousands, and then a few percentage of them have talent. So there's a sifting process on the left and none on the right. And it's the same all along from film school on. There are training programs on the left, there are distribution companies on the left, there are funding sources on the left, there are publicity companies and social media companies geared to films on the left. There's a whole ecosystem on the left that they've created over this 50-year period. Educational distribution companies, and on and on and on. And it's their total right to do it. This is a free country, and they are wise to use these cultural media to control what I call the storytelling media. They want to tell the stories of America. And we have simply to do the same. I mean, the answer is simple, but it is a complicated and difficult process.
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent point to make, because a lot of the times when we think of, the woke Hollywood, or, who's kind of influencing everyone, we just think of the actors or the directors, right, and the producers, just like the main folks who we are most familiar with. You're like, okay, so obviously there's going to be money there. Obviously the directors are, they're part of the staffing decisions. And then there's the actors who are very outspoken on social media and make their viewpoints very known, sometimes almost like kind of like a virtue signaling effect, in that they want to make sure they get hired. So they got to keep saying these things. But we do forget that you're right. It's like it's an entire industry. So there are so many jobs and educational backgrounds that everyone comes from that are going into this field that are still very much heavily influenced by the far left, funded by the far left, and of course they weed out anyone who goes in the opposite direction. So that's so fascinating, because like historically, when we think of like Hollywood back in, the 60s, it did come off as kind of a more conservative, if you look at some of these old Westerns with John Wayne and director John Ford and some of the stuff that they were putting out. When did this shift take place? And was it always maybe like a political industry, or did it somehow get more politicized over time as the left took over?
Well, I think you're right, Cherise, that traditionally Hollywood, whatever its many other flaws and foibles, was very pro-American. I mean, as is well known, it was largely built by these Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they were happy to be Americans, and they loved the country, and they gave them great opportunity, and they wanted to make patriotic, pro-American films. And they also thought that would be a way to make a lot of money, that Americans would want to see them. And they were right. And I think the Westerns that you cite are a good example. You know, these John Ford Westerns, or even more broadly, John Wayne Westerns. I mean, John Wayne symbolized individualistic, can-do Americans, and to America and to the world. And I think that's why, for many decades, or it's part of the reason at least, why people in the world wanted to come here and be Americans and be like that and take advantage of that liberty and opportunity. And Hollywood really promoted that ideal and that myth, broadly speaking. And that was really to the benefit of the country and the world. And then I think it changed in the 60s. In fact, you know, I mentioned the Long March to the Institutions. Lots of people from the actual New Left, SDS and other organizations, actually went to Hollywood to make movies and worked in the studios. And then it began to change. I mean, it changed with the breakup of the big studios in the Hollywood system. And that gave an opening for independent producers and directors to make movies like, say, Easy Rider in the 60s. And there was all this sort of, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Hollywood in the 60s, and it all sort of changed. And so I would mark it then, just as the culture as a whole changed, that's when Hollywood changed. But it changed particularly rapidly in Hollywood, and Hollywood was a leader in that cultural change. That's one reason why I am not one of these conservatives who think we can change Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood is what it is. You know, it's very committed to these ideas. Now it's very much dominated by graduates from elite universities. People go to Harvard Business School or Harvard Law School and then go to work at Hollywood in business affairs or running a studio. And so they take the woke ideology of elite schools with them. So you can get an occasional Hollywood movie that's a little different, and an occasional Hollywood director like Clint Eastwood that somehow comes through and has a different perspective. But the idea of changing the whole institution, I think, is a false goal, a dream of conservatives, and I've heard it over the decades. I say that it's like trying to, if we were dealing with politics and we had only one party, the Democratic Party, you wouldn't want to try to change it. You'd want to do another party, like a Republican Party, that had different ideas. And you cannot really expect Hollywood to change. It's hugely successful. They're making bucket loads of money. Why should they change? I mean, that's not the way markets work. We should know that as conservatives. And they are deeply embedded in their cultural, institutional ways. And the Me Too movement has only made it even more so. So I think looking for change in Hollywood is the wrong way to go. The right way to go for conservatives is to build our own institutions and make our own films and television. And I think the place to start, I say this with a little bias, is in documentaries and small feature films, you know, that are dealing with history and politics. And that's, I think, rather than the big Hollywood blockbusters, you know, these superhero movies that in fact make all their money, and which is why they're so deeply tied to China. Another reason they're unlikely to change.
Right.
We are unlikely to be able to compete in that area, and Hollywood dominates the world in that market. But the film, this is a moment of renaissance in documentaries alone. There are huge numbers of them on HBO and Showtime and Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime, and they are telling the stories of the recent past and the distant past and the founding, from the founding to today. And we need to tell those stories, and through small movies that deal with politics. I mean, HBO and Netflix are constantly making films like the Chicago 7 or whatever that give their view of, in that case, the 60s, but of American history. And that's sort of their right. We need to sort of counter that with our own culture. I've often heard over the many decades I've been involved in this, conservatives complaining. And I've been at many conferences where conservatives talk about how we've lost the culture and we need to do more and how Hollywood's a problem. But what conservatives are reluctant to actually do is make films and television. Writing books about it, complaining about it, holding conferences, even by friends of mine, is a nice pastime. But to change the culture, you have to be involved in making culture.
Right.
And actually, the left does that more. They actually like culture more. They're more interested in culture and the arts and even movies. Conservatives really do not like it. And they have, it seems to them, vaguely distasteful. So in effect, they've ceded it to the left, and the consequences are evident.
I want to pull on something that you mentioned with the documentaries, because that is kind of its own, that has definitely taken off. You see all of these new documentaries coming out, whether it's like true crime or, you know,
Mm.
something more historical, like you mentioned, a political issue that they want to really emphasize with the Chicago Seven, or, but we don't see as many on conservative figures as much. And so like this can go back to kind of what you were mentioning, where conservatives are just not interested. They're not drawn to making these types of films. But there is something specific, and I'm curious. Documentaries are always going to be more blatant in their messaging than films, than fictitious films. Are you seeing at all folks in the documentary world? Are you seeing your peers? Do they hold back when they're making these films with their messaging, even in the documentary stuff, or are they self-censoring essentially? Is what I'm asking, or do you feel like they're just like afraid to do certain issues, like cover certain topics?
Well, almost, I mean, I know a lot of documentary producers, and I know a lot on the left as well as on the right.
Hmm.
And I mean, because of the reasons I said earlier, you know, the most talented, there's a huge number of talented documentary producers on the left. And I think to make a good documentary, you can't be that blatant in your message. You have to be focused on storytelling. And I actually think this is a good moment for left-wing documentary makers. There's, as you say, a huge amount of that material on streaming and elsewhere. And most of it isn't exactly blatant. I mean, it's blatant in the sense that what they really don't do is give the other side. I mean, there used to be an
Right. Yeah.
emphasis on documentaries to tell both sides. They really only give one side, but they really try to make it story-oriented rather than preachy. There are way fewer number of documentary makers on the right. They tend to be way more preachy, sadly. I
Hmm.
mean, maybe because they're desperate to get their message out, but they're much closer to propaganda than on the left. And we really need to up our game in the way we produce media, period, documentaries as well as drama.
Right.
Um, but so on the right, I don't think they're holding back, but they're not sufficiently kind of in tune with the storytelling techniques of the time.
Gotcha.
So I don't think so. I mean, I think that's more or less the constellation of the politics of it all.
Hmm. And so to go back to what we're seeing with some of the younger up and coming filmmakers, as you mentioned, all of these schools that they're all going to are very, very much on the left, and they're really only producing folks who kind of toe that line. Um, so what do we, I guess, is there a way to tap into that somehow, like on the side with the younger generation? Do you see any trends actually with them, with younger generations being more brazen in their attempts to put conservative messaging in film, or is this still something that we're going to have to work on? And if so, is there kind of an opening to encourage them to take those risks? I feel like there are a lot of conservatives in Hollywood and the filmmaking industry, but they're just not willing to kind of take that risk to mess with their own
Well, I
career.
think if there were, I mean, I think the key thing is that over these many decades, we on our side haven't invested the money in it. I mean, if there were money and product and distribution, people would make more conservative product. I mean, a lot of people in Hollywood just go where the money is and are not deeply political.
Okay.
There's plenty of those, and all the money is only in one direction, and they're
Right.
following it. A reasonable response to economic incentives. So I think if we created these institutions, there would be people that would be interested in participating. I think, in a way, the biggest stumbling block at the moment is that a lot of the distribution, I mean, at one point, we all thought that streaming services like Amazon and Netflix were going to be free of bias and that they
Mhm.
would be open platforms and they would take programs from the left and the right without editorial input. But that has changed a lot in the last year or so. I mean, every one of those streaming services are just like their Hollywood peers. They're very overt in their politics, especially the leadership of those organizations. And the example that you cited, Cherise, of my own documentary on Clarence Thomas is Clarence Thomas being canceled by Amazon is yet another example of that, of which there are many. So I think if there were institutions out there, we would be able to then be able to find talent.
Yeah.
But we actually, I have to say, we on our little Manifold Productions, we have gotten a grant to help develop the next generation
Great.
of conservative filmmakers and to up their game and raise their ability to produce. And I think we are looking to find people who have talent that we could kind of mentor and help along. And we have grants to fund some small films produced by these people that could maybe make a difference. And so I think it has to move on all these fronts
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah, something that's interesting. So with all these streaming services that have been kind of coming out, Netflix, Amazon, they're all creating their own films now. So they all
That's
have
right.
like they're producing them, directing them, casting them, and everything. And they've got a lot of big names in them. So they're clearly not just streaming now. Obviously, they're becoming part of the industry itself. In every sense of the way, because like you said, there's just so much money there. It's like, how can you not? So we are seeing a little bit of a reaction. So in addition to like the grants and stuff that Manifold Productions is doing, you see also companies like Daily Wire also trying to get kind of into the filmmaking industry as well. Do you think this is going to be a new trend with conservative organizations and companies to kind of see if there's ways to create these alternative routes for conservatives, but not and like you mentioned, these more subtle ways, not just kind of like this blatant messaging of conservative propaganda, but more kind of we're creating good movies, good films, good documentaries on real issues that actually do have this like pro-America bent to it.
Well, I hope it's a trend. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think it's great that Daily Wire and others are attempting to do more in this area. But it still needs to be vastly bigger. I can't, I
Yeah.
want to make sure your audience is aware of the difference in size. I mean, even if you put Manifold and Daily Wire and even Fox Nation and others that are trying in this area on one side, they're tiny compared to the very vast system on the left, even in documentaries and small feature films. I mean, it's this difference between tens of millions and tens of billions over decades. And we can't really expect these small things to counter the big things. I mean, in terms of the influence of these stories, which is where I think you began, Cherise, the influence depends on the repeated messaging. I mean, that's the way it works in media. And one documentary, like even our Clarence Thomas documentary, in a sea of left-wing documentaries, isn't going to make that much of a difference. It makes a difference, maybe even disproportionate to its size. But since it's 1 to like 1,000, it's hard. If it were 1 to 10, I think it could start to make some kind of difference. I think we have a comparative advantage because A, we reflect the views of a huge majority of the American people, and these stories, these positive stories, are in fact more compelling drama and have been historically.
Yeah. So I do want to discuss a little bit about some of the challenges you face, and this goes to what you were saying about Amazon and canceling. What are some of the challenges and obstacles though that conservative filmmakers will face post-production, like getting it out there? Because in addition to like creating it and getting the money behind it to create it and making it good quality, you also have to get it out there and get it known.
Well, that is the point. I mean, that there is where the challenge is. The sort of way is smooth for talented left-wing filmmakers, to the credit of the media, the people who care about that. And it is hard on the right. I mean, we've made over 15 documentaries, and all of them, or all but one, have aired on PBS. And that has been a great distribution source for us, and they have been great to us. And you can reach millions of people, and we've always been focused on trying to reach the middle of the country, not just preaching to the choir, even though that's important too. But we want to reach people who have not heard these views, like our Clarence Thomas film. We very much wanted it to reach the people who didn't know his story and who maybe didn't agree with him and had never heard his arguments, so that they hear them. Not that it would convince all of them, but they would be more aware. They'd at least hear the other side, and then some might be convinced. So that's always been our goal, and that is way harder for us because a service like, say, Netflix strikes the average viewer as having everything, and they go there, and then they're sort of constrained by the offerings that it provides, and for Amazon too. So it's hard for makers of conservative films. They have to actually, their easy way to go is, I mean, this is why they tend to be kind of red meat propaganda for very right-wing conservatives, because that's their basic distribution model. They can go put it on Vimeo or YouTube and then kind of go advertise it, go on Fox or go try to get go on podcasts such as yours and try to talk about their film and get that core audience to tune in. So then they can do that, but it doesn't ever get out of the conservative box. So it isn't then part of this sort of ecosystem of films and television that are sort of shaping the broader American picture of these things. So that's really a challenge, and it's not 100% the fault of these filmmakers. It's up to the rest of the conservative world to help create these institutions. I mean, they're easy to do. There's a model for doing them. You know, there are people on the left who keep doing new ones every time. I mean, we could do it too. It isn't, you know, it isn't difficult. But we need to provide those ways to go for these filmmakers. Otherwise, it really is a challenge. I mean, they end up, you know, on some sort of web service where they get a huge number of hits, and it looks good, but they're not actually entering the media, the sort of, you know, broader media landscape and affecting a broad enough range of views of average Americans.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, that would be like the next step. If, as you mentioned, if we're going to create this entire alternative, there has to be also a post-production pathway to get these films out there, to get the proper coverage, and to have somewhere where they can, you know, show the product, obviously, and get enough viewership, like you mentioned, as well, with people who are not just in the echo chamber of conservatism, but also who are, you know, in the cities, who don't hear the other side. I was just talking to someone about it the other day, about how it's amazing how much we all have in common. You know, we actually, if you, and this is such an issue with students on college campuses as well, they're always screaming at each other or refusing to interact, or therefore like self-censoring. But what ends up happening is they don't actually realize how much they actually have in common with most things. They only really disagree on some of these key issues. But you know, there is kind of a balance to be had there. And once that discussion happens, there's all of a sudden the anger kind of goes away, you know, the hatred goes away. It's more of like, okay, we just disagree on these core issues and we can have a conversation about it. And it comes back to this film, like showing the Clarence Thomas story. I mean, how many times have people tried to cancel him on university campuses and take his name off of things? They probably have no idea who he is or what he's done, where he's come from. They literally don't know anything about him. It's just they know what he represents. And there's this hatred that's just directly attached to that. And the hatred part is like obviously the biggest issue in the country right now with the direction that we're going. But I want to take a shift here onto something you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I kind of brought up too, which is how beholden the filmmaking industry is to China. And this is something that obviously my background initially is national security, and I'm really concerned with, because I feel like China is just like very insidious, and it's kind of very much ingrained in everything that we do, especially anything that has to do with money. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of money to be had in the filmmaking industry. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the China issue with regard to all of this, and if there's any way around or out of that relationship.
I think that you're right, Cherise. Hollywood is very indebted to China. I mean, especially on these blockbuster, you know, Marvel comic, you know, superhero movies, which is Hollywood's bread and butter. I mean, and they're, you know, they've done shocking things, as you know, such as taking out things that are offensive to the Chinese communist leadership, thanking, you know, the region of China where they're persecuting Uyghurs. You know, it's sort of unbelievable. I don't see how it can possibly change in the near term. I mean, it's really, you know, you know, I think they're really deeply stuck in that relationship. I mean, the way Hollywood is they're willing to kowtow to China on one hand, but then they're politically correct in their smaller movies and documentaries here. So on these big blockbusters, 100 million plus budgets, they're going to go one way. But, you know, then they allow their actors, who also some of them don't like bowing to China, to reflect their woke political views on smaller vehicles here.
Yeah.
And I don't see that changing. And I think it is a terrible thing. I mean, it will only change when our relationship to China changes. And I don't know when that'll happen.
Right. Yeah. That's the big question, right? So I'm curious. So we've talked about a number of various solutions, part of which is obviously creating pathways for conservative filmmakers to be able to create products, but then also to get them out there and to get them heard, but also just trying to get the conservative movement in general more interested in filmmaking, in making documentaries and these kind of these smaller films. I'm curious, do you have any words of advice or wisdom from what you've seen? I mean, you've been in this industry for a long time. What do you think are some of the next steps for us to try to get people more involved and more interested in this?
Well, I do think if there's anyone out there that is interested, they should reach out to us. Let me
Absolutely.
give I got to give our website.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's manifoldproductions.com, manifoldproductions with an S.com. And also you can find out how to see the Clarence Thomas film, which I think, is a good
It's a
start.
great film, by the way. Love it.
Thank you. I think if you're interested in film, you have to start watching them and caring about them.
Yes.
So I think that um, I think that among young people, there is a potential interest in film. I think people do want to do that if there were some sort of pathway. And I think that we need the larger, look, there are lots of billionaires in America, and there are some on the left as well as on the right. The ones on the left seem to be pretty motivated in this area. We need to motivate those on our side. On the left, there are all these people who make, I don't know, $10 billion in Silicon Valley, and they figure they'll take a $500 million or $1 billion and give it to their daughter or their son to run a production company in Hollywood, and they'll try to make money. But if they don't make money, at least they are raising awareness about climate change or something, and they're willing to lose money slowly, and it takes a while before you get to the $500 million or $1 billion that they're willing to lose. On our side, we don't have that. They have, well, making movies is just like any other business. I only want to invest in it if the profits are certain guaranteed, and it's not actually a good investment, and it's high risk, which is all true. And then they say, I think I'll pass, ceding the ground to the left. But we need to put pressure on the billionaires on our side, to at least one or two of them or several of them, to take an interest in this and put the time and money into it. And they have to believe in it and care about it. But I think it's part and parcel about caring about the country. Just to return to the first theme, if we let one side, the left, tell all of America's stories about our past, our history, our recent past, our politics, what will young people believe? I mean, they will not hear the other side.
Right.
And that's really on us. We need to get that out there. I mean, Shelley said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. And by poets, he meant storytellers. And that was true then. More recently, Andrew Breitbart said, politics is downstream from culture, a less, poetic way of putting it. But you have to start with culture. We need to sort of get our stories out there, and I think that there are stories that resonate with the American people that they want to hear. And what I am really encouraged by is the fact that even with the left controlling all the communications media, Hollywood and big tech and the news media and the documentary world, still, half the country more or less voted for Trump and half voted for Biden. So there's half that were unconvinced, and it's more than half that don't really share the woke ideology of the left. If you take the middle, moderate Democrats and Republicans together, it's a large slice of America that still shares these values, and it's up to us to give them, the depth of understanding and the stories that they need to tell to sort of support that. And so it's really on us, broadly speaking.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think if we've learned anything in the last few years about the American public, there may be folks who are willing to vote for Biden, for example, but when it comes to some of this far left progressive agenda, they're absolutely not on board with it. And I think there's a lot of that in the filmmaking industry as well, a lot of that sentiment there. And if we create these avenues and, like you said, get the money behind it, it will encourage folks to start stepping out, I think, a little bit more as, hey, I want to make films about this issue. This issue is very important to me, about like the American story or the American dream, something that's completely separate from what you're seeing in Hollywood right now. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for being on the show. This is Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, and activists on topics such as free speech, higher education, and related topics for American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube. Also, we have the podcast, which is on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, any of the podcast platforms that you use. Give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard today. I'm Cherise Trump, and Michael, that was Well Said.
Thank you.